The villagers didn't just follow her. They obeyed her every word, even when those words meant taking a life. They turned on their neighbors, forced them down, and when it was over, silence was the only thing left. When she raised her chalice, they didn't question it. They called it divine. She told them she was a goddess, and in the dark of that mountain cave, they believed her completely. No one ran. No one resisted. This wasn't ancient history. It was 1963, in a forgotten Mexican village tucked beneath the Sierra Madre. The woman they worshipped wasn't born into power. She had once been a teenage girl, poor, overlooked, and used to being invisible. But inside that cave, with smoke curling around her feet and dozens of eyes staring up in awe, she tasted something more intoxicating than blood: control. Her name was Magdalena Solís, and what started as an act became a doctrine of death. A female serial killer crowned by those she condemned. To understand how this happened, how a single woman turned fear into faith and faith into execution, we have to go back to the night a boy came running down the mountain. He was exhausted, shaking, too scared to make sense of what he'd just seen. But when the police finally asked what he was running from, he whispered a single word: vampires. The Hernandez brothers had done this before. They arrived in towns with desperation in the air and left with their pockets full. The formula was simple: smoke, robes, sacred names, and a warning no one dared to ignore. But in this village, something shifted before they could finish the act. Magdalena wasn't part of the show. She stood quietly beside them, barely noticed at first. Then someone asked who she was, and someone else said she had the look of a spirit-touched girl. No one told her to speak. But when she did, everyone leaned closer. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't shout, didn't chant. She spoke as if the knowledge had always been hers. Who was marked, what offerings were needed, where the spirits were unsettled. People started bringing things: bread, coins, chickens, not for the brothers, for her. They watched her eyes, not their hands, and when she nodded, even slightly, they took it as a sign. There were no rules written, no shifts declared. But over days, everything realigned around her. The brothers paused more often. They waited before speaking. At first, it was deference. Then it became habit. No one announced the change. It was there in the way feet gathered where she stood, in the way people turned when she turned. Magdalena never reached out to take control. It settled on her like dust, quiet, unshakable, impossible to ignore. Stories move faster than facts. Someone claimed she had healed a child. Another said she predicted a storm. Truth didn't matter. What mattered was how quickly belief hardened into certainty. The village adjusted. Rituals grew more focused. People who once shrugged at the brothers now lowered their eyes in her presence. The rituals became a way of life, not performance. Not driven by fear of punishment, but by something deeper: alignment, belonging. And in the background, the brothers receded. They still lit fires, still said prayers. But it was her timing they followed. Her silence they waited on. Magdalena never asked for that power, but she no longer had to. Every room she entered shifted toward her. Every breath, every hesitation moved to her rhythm. She had stopped playing a part. Now the village was playing theirs. The villagers weren't just watching Magdalena anymore. They were searching for themselves in her eyes. She didn't promise salvation. She didn't need to. Her silence gave them space to imagine something greater than rules or fear. One by one, they stepped forward, Not to confess, but to be seen. Men who felt forgotten, women who had buried children, dreams, or both. Old men with hands worn by labor, and young girls with voices too quiet for the world to notice. They came with stories, not sins. And she listened, not with pity, not with comfort. Her attention felt like quiet judgment, sharp, unwavering, but somehow brought peace. Magdalena didn't have to say she understood them. They believed she already did. Each time she locked eyes with someone, a shift occurred, a tilt in posture, a tear that slipped before they noticed, a breath held too long. In that moment, it didn't feel like worship. It felt like recognition. For years, their lives had passed unnoticed, by the government, by the church, even by their neighbors. Now, someone stood at the center and saw everything. They offered more than gifts. They offered memories, regrets, entire lifetimes. And Magdalena accepted them without flinching. What the brothers once faked with ritual, she made real with presence. Children sat near her feet. Mothers brought water for her hands. Even silence became sacred when she was near. No one called her kind. No one called her cruel. She was something else entirely, an answer they hadn't realized they were waiting for. The idea that she might be divine wasn't something spoken out loud. It grew quietly in the spaces between rituals. It filled the pauses. It lived in the way people began to speak her name less and look for her more. Her power didn't come from fear or force. It came from attention. And in a place where no one had felt truly seen in decades, that was enough to change everything. The stories about Magdalena no longer stayed in the village. They moved, quietly, then urgently, across hills and into nearby towns. People heard whispers of a woman who didn't need to speak loudly to be obeyed. A woman who could read your past from the way you stood or the way you hesitated before meeting her gaze. To outsiders, it sounded like folklore. But the police in San Luis Potosi began to wonder why so many young men were vanishing from the remote mountain areas. They received strange reports, sightings of bonfires in the hills, families refusing to speak, travelers who never came back. At first, no one mentioned her name, just vague rumors. A new priestess, a powerful one, maybe not even human. But then came the boy. Thin, terrified, half-starved. He arrived at a police outpost trembling, barely able to form words. He said there were rituals, that people were dying, that it was led by a woman they called divine. The officers didn't take it seriously. One said he'd probably escaped a cult. Another said he was hallucinating from fear. Then the boy lifted his shirt and showed them the scars. Rope marks, bruises, burned skin. He said they weren't only witnesses. They were forced into choices no one should ever face. And suddenly, it wasn't just a superstition. It became a case. A true crime investigation was launched, but quietly. They didn't want panic. Officers were sent undercover, dressed like pilgrims, carrying hidden weapons. What they found wasn't chaos. It was order, a structured group, rituals with specific timings, rules, punishments, hierarchies, and at the top, Magdalena. She didn't act like a leader. She sat in silence while others made declarations. She didn't give commands. She gave prophecy. But what unsettled the investigators most wasn't her control. It was how willing the people were to give it. They described her with reverence, but also with fear, as if she could see everything they'd ever regretted. One agent reported that even after weeks of surveillance, he couldn't tell where belief ended and obedience began. This was no longer just a group of manipulated villagers. This was a system built on psychological control, on the promise that someone finally understood you, and the threat of what happened when you disappointed her. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This was not spontaneous. The village had fallen into a rhythm, rituals with purpose, rules that felt sacred, and consequences that no one dared to test. And it was spreading. For the first time, authorities began to use the term female serial killer. But this wasn't a killer who worked in secret. She was worshipped in daylight, surrounded by followers, protected by the very people she harmed. And that's what made her dangerous. In criminal psychology, it's rare to see mass compliance without coercion. But Magdalena didn't need to chase fear. She let others carry it to her. The villagers had followed her not because they were tricked, but because they needed to believe. In a life stripped of control, belief gave structure. Magdalena gave that structure shape. She no longer needed to speak. Her presence guided choices. Disputes were settled by asking what she would want. Fasts began when she turned away a plate. Rituals intensified if she paused longer than usual. What started as reverence evolved into routine and then into demand. People stopped asking whether a ritual was needed. They performed it to avoid her silence. They brought offerings before dawn, whispered chants even when their voices shook. Those who hesitated weren't punished by her hands, but their neighbors took notice. Food disappeared, doors stayed shut. Children were told not to speak with them. Some villagers tried to leave. One by one, they vanished into the hills. No bodies were found. No searches were organized. The village acted as if they had never existed. Inside this order, fear settled in quietly. Not the fear of Magdalena's wrath, but the fear of falling from her gaze. To be unseen by her now felt like exile. The rituals grew stranger. Nights stretched into dawn. Fires were lit with precision. A woman was made to kneel for hours, not by force, but because she believed her guilt had poisoned her family. Another poured oil over her own hands to cleanse her bloodline, as the group demanded. The lines between belief and obedience dissolved. What once soothed now compelled. What began in awe now pressed down like weight. Even the Hernandez brothers, who once led the stage, could no longer redirect the current. They followed her rhythm, echoed her silence, mimicked her detachment. But underneath that silence, Magdalena had changed. She no longer watched with softness. Her eyes held stillness, but it didn't comfort. It unsettled. She saw what people feared most in themselves and offered no relief. And when someone flinched, others looked away, not to protect them, but to avoid sharing their fate. This wasn't the power she had started with. It had hardened, cold, efficient, absolute. What began as a local mystery had shifted into a true crime pattern. A female serial killer hiding behind symbols and ritual. In criminal psychology, what made her so dangerous wasn't brutality. It was how fully others surrendered themselves to her presence. And when the rituals left someone broken, no one asked why. They simply swept the ashes, reset the altar, and continued. In a village where no one wanted to be last to kneel, cruelty didn't need to shout. It wore quiet robes, moved in silence, and carried the weight of belief in every step. The village no longer functioned like a community. It moved like a closed circuit, predictable, obedient, unblinking. No one asked questions, no one needed to. They had learned to read Magdalena's stillness the way others might read scripture. Authorities who managed to enter found no chaos. What they saw was order so precise it felt unnatural. Chants were timed. Meals were shared with ritualistic pacing. Every glance had weight. Every silence had purpose. The agents expected disorder. Instead, they found discipline. But that discipline came at a cost. Those who faltered, who missed a step, who hesitated before offering weren't punished outright. They were quietly removed. No announcements, no accusations. One day they were present. The next, their homes were empty and no one spoke their names. Investigators noted how the villagers responded. Not with panic, not even concern, only deeper compliance. It was as if absence had become part of the ritual, a silent way to restore balance. Magdalena remained at the center of it all, unmoved. She watched without expression, but the weight of her gaze shifted rooms. She didn't need to speak to assert power. Her presence alone set the rhythm. Search teams began uncovering secluded sites hidden in the hills. Not official graves, no markings, no records, just quiet resting places with arrangements that suggested ceremony. Arms crossed, objects placed near the body, or turned face down with unsettling precision. No one could fully interpret their meanings, but clearly, symbolism mattered. The deeper they looked, the less helpful conventional methods became. What the investigators saw wasn't mere manipulation. It resembled a belief system rooted in habit, rehearsed through ritual, and reinforced over time. Experts in criminal psychology called it a rare case of group delusion sustained without force. A textbook true crime anomaly, one where obedience replaced empathy and ritual replaced reason. Villagers shown evidence of harm didn't express denial. They explained. They spoke of balance, of purification, of necessity. What concerned officials most wasn't the control Magdalena held. It was how willingly others upheld it. Children stopped comforting neighbors. Elders averted their gaze when others were taken away. There were no protests, because stepping out of rhythm meant dissonance, and dissonance had no place in a village that had forgotten how to question. The phrase female serial killer no longer felt sufficient. What unfolded here had little to do with secrecy or isolated violence. It thrived on structure, built through silence, protected by ritual, and resistant to reason. Magdalena remained untouched. No accusation reached her. No investigation penetrated the wall of reverence. Justice stalled, held back not by resistance but by devotion. Magdalena was eventually captured, but not dismantled. Her arrest stopped the rituals, but not the belief. In nearby towns, people still whispered her name, not with devotion, but with caution, as if saying it too clearly might call something back. Psychiatrists called her delusional. Officials called her dangerous. But those labels didn't explain the silence she left behind. The village didn't collapse after her. It continued, quieter, colder, stripped of names and memories. No one built statues. No one burned them either. They simply went on, as if nothing had happened. Years later, scholars debated whether she was a cult leader, a female serial killer, or something in between. But the villagers never gave her a title. They had already given her everything else. And perhaps that's the lasting terror of this story. Not how much harm one person can do, but how far people will go when they believe harm is holy.